Welcome to this video supporting Chapter 11 of my iOS 7 Development for Absolute Beginners book. This is part 2 of the course on Chapter 11 for web views and web connections. In the previous section you saw how to create an app that used the web view to connect to the internet and render the contents of the website. But also a very common scenario is the data that you want from the web isn't presented as a web page and it's just straight data. So let's take a look at building an application, a simple application for that. So for example, in this case, on this website, iOS7developer.com/book/quotes.php, every time you call this site, it gives you a random quote from Martin Luther King. So I'm going to refresh it and we see like a number of different quotes come up. So how would we build an application that gives us random quotes from Martin Luther King? We'll take a look at how to do that here. So as usual, let's create a new Xcode project. We'll create it as a single view application. We'll call it MLK Quotes. And organization name, company identifier doesn't really matter, but be sure to leave the class prefix empty and the devices to be iPhone. And press next. It's going to ask you when you want to put it. I'm just going to put mine on the desktop and make sure that source control is unchecked. So now the app will be created for us, and it's our familiar app with an app delegate, a main storyboard, and a view controller. We're going to edit the main storyboard in this case. And we're going to add a label and a button to it. So I'm going to go to the controls palette and take a label and drag and drop it and give it a decent amount of size and place it nicely. And then I'm going to add a button. This is very similar to the type of application we were building in way back in chapter 2 and 3. But we're going to, instead of just hello world text, we're going to grab the text from the web. And instead of the caption button, I'm going to say get quote. And let me recenter it. So we have our label, we have our button, we've set our button to say get quote. Our label is centered. Let's center the text horizontally as well. And let's see. Okay. One other thing I want to do on my label is just at the line breaks, I'm going to just word wrap. So then my words will get wrapped onto successive lines. So if I have a long quote, it would appear in the label without being truncated. So the next thing we want to do is create an outlet for our label and an action for our button. So I'm going to open the assistant. I'll close this sidebar. Make sure that the assistant is on viewcontroller.h. And I'm going to drag the label and drop it and create an outlet. And I'll just call it LBL quote. And then I'm going to drag the button and drop it and create an action on touch up inside, and I'll just say it's button get quote, something like that. Okay, so now it's time to edit the view controller file to implement the code that the user will execute upon pressing the button. So I'm going to open viewcontroller.m. I can leave the assistant open so that I have my H code and my M code side by side. So there's a few things that we're going to need to do here. Now, when we created the action btn get quote, this footprint was created for us, so the stub for the function, so we can come in and we can start editing this one. So the first thing is that when we actually call the web for content, one of the things that we need to do is have what's called a callback in case there's an error. And this is going to use an NSError object, error equals nil. It's not doing anything right now, but you'll see that in a moment. And now I'm going to have to create a URL like we did in the previous one, where I'm going to say NSURL, URL with string, and my string is going to be http:// and whatever the address here was, iOS7developer.com/book/quotes.php. Whoops, I have two HTTPs. I'll delete that. A semicolon here, and the code wraps because of the width of the window. So like if I change the width of the window, we can see the code. It looks good like that. And then I want to create a string that I'm going to call the quote, and I can create a string using the contents of a URL. So I can say ns string with, and you see all these different things we can do string with, and one of them is string with contents of URL. So I'm going to do this one, and I need to tell it the URL, and that's just what I've created, the URL. Then I need to tell it the encoding, and strings have lots of different encodings, but a common one that's used for the web is called ASCII, the American Standard Code for Information Interchange. So I'm just going to say the encoding is NS ASCII string encoding. And then it also needs to know what to do in the case of an error, and I have to say like this, ampersand error, which means I'm giving it the address of the error object that I created earlier on. So if an error happens, like I'll be able to take a look at it within this error object. Now, if the string ends up being downloaded, so the quote will not be null, so I can say if the quote like this, then all I have to do is say lbl quote.text equals the quote. Otherwise, I'm going to say lbl quote, lbl quote.text means we've had an error, so I can just read the error string using string with format. I'm going to say error can't get quote details percent at, and if you remember how we did building strings in the past, that's just, it's going to take the string that's within error and replace this percent at with that string, and then obviously this is going to build this string in NS string, which I'm going to then load into lbl quote. And that's pretty much it. That's all I have to do. So I'm creating a URL out of the address here. I'm using that URL to create a new string using string with contents of URL. So the string that would be whatever random quote gets called up whenever I call this string will be then downloaded and loaded into a string called the quote, and then I can just load that string into my label, or if something goes wrong, I'm going to load the error details into my label. So let's run it and take a look. So I now have my label, and I'm going to press get quote. It's going to go off to the internet, and it's going to give me this one. I must have set something up wrong in my label. I'll just go back and check that. But we see now the quote's being loaded, so let's go and fix. Let's see what we did wrong. If I go back to main storyboard and I select the label, I can turn off the assistant and turn on the sidebar, and we can see that the number of lines in my label is only 1. So I can give my label 2 lines, 3 lines, or something like that, or I can give it 0 lines, in which case it will fit the available space. So why don't we say 0 lines and then rerun the app. And now if I get quote, we can see that it runs properly. The function of education is to teach one to think intensively and to think critically. Intelligence plus character, that's the goal of true education. A beautiful quote and a great way to end this video.